Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Security Repo Podcast. If you've been in security for a while, you'll notice that there is a pretty common trend that we see a lot, and that is breaches that happen because of open data buckets. We're going to discuss exactly what these open buckets are, why they are open to the public, and if there's any use for them. And we're going to delve into some of the issues that surround it and why it's such a big problem in security. We have a great guest to help us unpack this journey. We're joined by Glen Helton, who is the Director of Information Security for an S&P 500 multinational organization. By night, he can be found cleaning up the streets of the internet through the Sky Witness project. Glen, thanks so much for being here and joining us on the podcast today.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to have you here. And this is something I talked to you when I met you back earlier this year at an event. It's just fascinating, this whole problem of open buckets. So let's just start there. Let's get a definition for our audience. When you say open bucket, what do you mean?
Sure. So open buckets are going to be Azure AWS S3 instances, Azure Blob Storage, DigitalOcean has a version, Google has a version. But basically, it's giant blob storage on the internet designed to hold, for the most part, publicly accessible data. Or at least that's how, when we say open buckets, we mean data that's publicly accessible, right? You can have a secure closed bucket, that's fine. But a lot of people will create these open buckets to store large volumes of information that they intend to share with the public. Not every open bucket should be open, however, and a lot data has a way of finding its way around into nooks and crannies that it doesn't belong in, and so people get in trouble and they accidentally put the wrong stuff in buckets that they shouldn't, and then hackers or other mischievous people come along and mine that data for further information to conduct breaches, or identity theft is very common in this space. So it's a huge issue.
Let's just define that a little bit further, because obviously we can think of I'm putting cat pictures on the internet. I'm putting marketing PDFs that I want everyone on the internet to read in all of their glory. Those seem like great ideas for open buckets, but what are some bad ideas? What are some bad use cases?
So what often happens is, first of all, people will accidentally back up a resource to the internet, and put it in an open bucket, not realizing what they're doing. What you'll see is a lot of developers who are developing applications where they assume that the RBAC controls within the application are controlling access, but the underlying storage layer is wide open, either due to misconfiguration or just a misunderstanding of how this stuff works, right? So let's say you have an app that, I don't know, looks up insurance data on vehicles or something, right? And you don't want anyone else to look at that data other than the people other than the insured. You can control that all you want inside the application. But if all of that data is sitting in an open storage blob, then, somebody like me can come along and find it. I have no idea what the application is. I could just look at the data. So that's a huge issue. You see a lot of SaaS platforms that are built on top of blob storage technology, right? And often they're just not secured properly, or through some mishap or misconfiguration, it winds up getting incorrectly permissioned.
Yeah, I that's really interesting. My next question was kind of going to be how on earth do these buckets end up being open? And you kind of covered a few of the reasons in there. Is it kind of just a misunderstanding of how the technology works? That people just assume that this is secure, or is it the fact that they kind of think that because the internet's massive, do they think that because their bucket's public, no one's going to find it, right? Who cares? Or is it kind of everything?
It's a little bit of both. I think for some organizations, they have a misunderstanding of just how they sort of assume that, well, nobody knows what this is or who it is, so nobody's going to find it, which just isn't true, right? The internet is not a place to hide in obscurity. But a lot of it is misconfiguration. It is very easy to misconfigure these storage accounts. And a lot of it is data that it's not necessarily that the bucket was misconfigured. The bucket may have a particular intention, right? Let's say you're trying to share publicly accessible tax records for the last 20 years for your municipality, but then someone in your organization has run out of space on their drive, and they just see, oh well, there's this other space here, and so they create some storage there and put a bunch of stuff in it that is definitely not public, but they don't understand that the underlying architecture is for that space is designed to be public. So there's a lot of misconfiguration. There's a lot of developer testing that starts out in private spaces but winds up in public spaces because people are testing, and I can't get it to work on my computer. Oh, let me just make let me just change stuff randomly till it works. Oh, look, it worked. But little do they know that there's downstream consequences of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm hearing a lot of similarities of how you're describing this and some of the problems that we see, in areas like GitHub. One of the things we do in Git Guardian is we scan all of the public repositories in GitHub, and we find lots of sensitive information in there. And one of the pushback we get is that, like, yes, but who's going to be looking in my GitHub account? I'm a student, or I'm just a junior developer, or I'm a senior developer working on, like, who's actually gives a crap about my GitHub? Like, no one's going to be looking in there for anything. But I think what people don't understand is, like, that worked for the phone book, but that doesn't work on the internet when you just have so much information, and people are, and you use the term that I love, I'm going to steal so much, are mining this data to try and find that sensitive information because it's broadcast on an API. And that small description that you used to describe it, mining, to me, that has such a amazing impact because it's not people stumbling across this randomly. They're mining for information like this. So yeah, I loved that point, and I love the similarities that you brought about it with that term.
Sure. And we often see, just like you might with Git Guardian, we often see developer credentials. We often see secure secrets also stored in buckets. Frankly, often I encounter instructions for how to do something, how to make the bucket open inside the bucket, and people are following the instructions and saying, oh, okay, I need to configure this storage this way, and by the way, here's the AWS keys that you need to use for this particular bucket that you're in. We see that often. I also see a lot of it's pretty common for developers who are working on a SaaS application to, particularly like a ticketing system or something like that, to store the credentials for the ticketing system, the credentials for all the remote controlling all the servers or whatever, all within tickets in the system. And you'll see that fairly commonly.
That totally makes sense, that you'd have artifacts of the dev process revealing information you probably don't want out there. But you see that in Docker all the time. It's like that layer is still there with the credentials, even though the next layer up erased it. That layer still exists. I want to ask about the scope of this problem, because this sounds like, yeah, people do this occasionally. This affects, some companies, but what's the scope here? What's the numbers you've seen?
So the number that we're tracking right now is there's about 11 billion publicly accessible files in open buckets. Billion with a B. Now, most of these files are correctly public. They're designed to be public, right? If you're hosting a static website and you've got a bunch of images and cat pictures or whatever, and it's just a static website, then that makes sense, right? You're going to have tons and tons and tons of JPEGs, tons and tons and tons of HTML, right? All that stuff you're intending to be public. The problem is that not everybody is doing that, or they're hosting what they think is a public website. But if your website has a login procedure, if your website has any sort of database attached to the back of it, yeah, it serves a public function, but it's not all designed to be public, right? So you'll see all of the configuration of the website, all the passwords, all the user information, all the stuff that people have uploaded will also be in there if the underlying storage isn't secure, right? But yeah, about 11 billion files right now, and God knows how many hundreds of thousands of, I think about 300,000 buckets themselves on AWS, probably about half that on Azure, and then it kind of trails off. DigitalOcean's got maybe 17,000, something like that, and GCP is probably around 20K. So it's a huge issue, and it's not getting, a year ago when we started this, we're like, this has to be declining, right? Everybody knows about this. Everybody, it's kind of a joke. Like open buckets are like, the first thing that security teams should know about. The problem is it's really hard to know about them for a couple of reasons, and we can talk about that. But it's not getting better. It's actually getting worse.
I mean, it really feels like that. I remember when I first kind of came into the security space from software development, and I just kept seeing like every news article was like open Amazon S3 buckets causing to a leak, and I was just kind of like, what on earth is going on? Like, surely, like, point number one in doing some kind of internal security review is, do we have any open buckets? But apparently not. Apparently we just keep.
It's a really difficult thing to answer, because in a lot of cases, your organization, even though you have a great security team that is on top of all of this, you can't know, if you're of sufficient size, all of the third-party development that is happening on your behalf. And those third-party developers are themselves using third-party developers, and those guys are just spinning up buckets all over the place, sharing data with each other, trying to get stuff worked out, right? So if you're giving data to a third party, let's say it's pricing data because you're developing some tax application for your organization, right? You're going to give that to some company that you're working with. They might create a bucket, put your data in it. You have no idea that your data is out there. You don't really have a way to search for it. Even if you're searching for within your own infrastructure, this bucket doesn't exist within your infrastructure. It exists in the infrastructure of a subcontractor. So it's very difficult to find.
Well, let's talk about what we do find inside these buckets. Yeah. Now, like, what have you found in there? I've noticed that the going trend for appropriately stored images is cat pictures. So obviously you're going to find a lot of cat pictures in there, or the equivalent of. But what is the stuff that you shouldn't see in open buckets?
So the most obvious thing that you're gonna, or the most concerning thing that you run across all the time, are going to be identity documents, or PII that's close enough to be, social security numbers, tax records, stuff like that, right? And the reason why you find that so often is, or much more often, say, than credit card data, right? When there's a credit card breach, people are aware of that right away, right? Somebody starts abusing these credit cards. The credit card company figures it out. They match it up, and they go, okay, this breach must have come from this location. And then somebody identifies that bucket and shuts it down, right? But when there's an identity theft breach, that never happens. That loop never closes. So identity is the gift that keeps on giving, right? So if you have, and I've encountered 10,000 driver's licenses in a bucket before, like actual scans front and back of the licenses, that is the gift that keeps on giving for attackers. They will constantly come back to that well and just reuse those identities over and over. And the people who are inadvertently sharing this don't have any idea, because there's never any closed loop. There's never anybody coming in and saying, hey, you did this bad thing, you need to stop. But I see a lot of driver's licenses. I see a ton of tax information for folks. I see legal documents. We see a lot of tracking systems are built on top of SaaS platforms. So you'll see a lot of like employee complaint tracking systems. You'll see, medical care tracking systems, all sorts of, I've gotten emails from 3-letter agencies about construction projects that are probably, not necessarily national secrets, but definitely, things that people shouldn't be sharing around. So there's just a wild collection of stuff out there. If it exists on people's computers, it exists in buckets.
Yeah.
It just blows my mind that you would put HR data into something that's not fully locked down, that you can prove, hey, no one has access to this thing.
It's funny because in a couple of instances I've come across very specifically, this is HR data. And when you look at the companies that have inadvertently exposed this stuff, that's their whole sales pitch is, this is a more secure way of storing your HR data than just on your, on your local network, right? We've got this, we can take care of this more securely, right? And that just, isn't always the case.
Man, there's so much I want to dig into with that. Like,
sure.
So how do you go about vetting? And maybe we'll talk about this later, but how do you go about vetting these parties, these third-party apps? Like, hey, how do I know I can trust you? What's the everybody can say anything.
That is as a consumer, as a subscriber to services or having custom development, it is really hard. I mean, there are well-known development shops that I see this stuff out there for. I don't know that I've encountered anything that says, hey, you know what, this development firm or this piece of software is, far and away better than anybody else from a security perspective, other than, reputation. It's just really difficult. And even if you're vetting that organization, you really have to understand, is that organization vetting its subcontractors? Is that organization vetting, people who provide data for it? And in a lot of cases, there's no way to know. Right. So if you're a really large organization, right, like the one I work for during the day, what you might do, and what I would suggest that you do, is find identifiable information that that you can control that kind of narrows you down. I mean, across billions of files, you're going to have an insane amount of false positives. But basically, search for this stuff yourself, right? Your company name is probably not good enough because there's probably a billion images and JPEGs and stuff with your company name all over the internet, right? CDNs that are just full of this stuff. But if you can identify something like a very specific term of art that your industry uses, or something, some collection of keywords, right? And you can even implant keywords in your data if you're that sophisticated. That might be difficult. Or like purchase order numbers, or just some piece of data that you would not expect to find on the internet. If you hunt buckets for that, eventually you'll find something and you'll be astonished.
So how did you get started in this? Like, were you looking for credit card numbers? What were you doing?
So this is exactly how I got started. I was doing a red team. I'm more of a network focused guy, but I was having a red team engagement done, and I was working with the consultants who were doing it, and they brought me this low finding, and it was like, hey, we just happened to find on the internet, this bucket with some of your data in it. I was like, that's an AWS bucket. I was like, we don't use AWS. That's obviously a false positive. And they said, well, check it out. And I said, well, what kind of, just educate me on the tools that you would use to even look for this stuff. Because I'm not going to, And so they did. I spent about a half an hour, learning some terrible tools and some amazing tools. And, went out and found, oh, hey, look, there's this data. It's got my company's name on it, but it's not actually my company's data, right? But it looks like my company's, like it really looks like it. Like if I found this on the internet, I'd be like, oh, that company was breached, right? But it turns out that it was test data that a developer had done for a project, right? So it wasn't particularly sensitive, but just in learning the tools, I was like, well, let me check and, just see what I would search for if I would search for this. And then I started finding other more concerning things. And then, because we're searching, because there's so many false positives, I kept finding things that were kind of related to my industry, but weren't my data. But I knew whose data this was. So, and I was like, man, if somebody found this about my data, I would want them to tell me right away. So I'd reach out to this person on LinkedIn, or I'd send them an email and say, hey, you might know me, you might not know me, but you should take a look at this. And then I'd encounter stuff that I'm like, okay, this has nothing to do with my company. This is not my data. This is not my problem. But it's like morally offensive that this particular thing is here, right? Like this is like problematic for the world that this particular set of data is here. So let me reach out to that person. And then, 150 hours and a million cups of coffee later, I've reached out to 1,000 people, and I sort of can't stop. And people are coming back to me now through my company email, and it starts to get weird. My company has nothing to do with this particular, with a liquor store in Idaho and why their employees' data is online. So I decided, you know what, I need to break out from doing this in the context of me as a professional person and find some other way to kind of responsibly notify people.
Yeah. I want to dive into responsible disclosure a little bit more in a minute. But first, I want to kind of dive in. You mentioned there some great tools, some shitty tools. I want to know what hints do you kind of have for hunting buckets and how you might even go about that, or what tools have worked well for you, what tools are trash.
Sure. I mean, if you can build your own pipeline, that's amazing, right? And we're doing that here. We've got a little project running called Skyscraper, which is taking all this stuff and building a pipeline for notification, and maybe trying to put some machine learning into that to figure out straight off the bat, like, is this bad or not, regardless of what exactly it is. But honestly, the easiest tool to get started with is called Gray Hat Warfare. Gray Hat goes out and indexes all of these buckets, right? And you can search Gray Hat across all the buckets, and that's kind of the key. If you're trying to find a bucket and then see what's in it, you've got a long road ahead of you, right? There's 11 billion of them. You're not going to get anywhere. Right. But if you can search across all buckets, and then just being a sort of network administrator type person, you can guess as to if you have these kinds of files in your bucket, I can pretty much guarantee that you didn't publicly intend to share that. Right. If you have a JPEG in your bucket, who knows? Probably it's a cat picture. Right. If you have HTML in your bucket, almost certainly you are intending to share that, right? XML, stuff like that, you're probably intending to share that stuff, or it's not particularly interesting. But if you have like a .rdp file, right, which is if you make a remote desktop connection in Windows and save that and drag it as a shortcut on your desktop, like, you're almost never going to find. There's like very little legitimate reason why that would be in a public bucket, right? So even though you don't care about the RDP files themselves, they're not that sensitive. They'll tell you a server name, but not any kind of credentials. But the fact that they exist in a bucket means that whatever else is in that bucket, people don't know what they're doing with, right? So then you go into that bucket and you start looking for Excel files and PDFs and whatever else you want to find, and that's where you're going to find massive amounts of inappropriately shared data. You could also search for file names, like you could search for confidential. Right. But what you're going to find is a billion JPEGs of the word confidential or something. Right. So it's very hard to do it that way. But searching for other common file types like .lnk, which is a desktop link. Right. You're almost never going to find that in a public resource. Right. I tried .bak, like backups. Right. But actually, there's a lot of like normal websites that produce backups in their open buckets, and it's just a backup of the site, and it's .bak, right? So you're not going to find too much there. .c for C code is always interesting, but you'll lose your mind very quickly looking at other people's C code.
Yeah, I was thinking like bash scripts as well, like
right.
Things like that.
And then what you'll find is a massive amount of open source stuff that's like part of libraries and stuff like that, or whatever. But compiled stuff you don't usually see like on the web.
It's, I mean, it sounds like there's like so much stuff that you're able to find on here, but almost it's kind of protected by the amount of data it was, because like undeniably there is going to be some XML files that are sensitive, or that there is some, but you just don't have the time, resources to kind of
I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for I'll look for that once I already know that I'm in a bucket. They don't know what they're doing. Right? Then the XML becomes interesting. Like everything becomes interesting.
That's really interesting, and kind of how to narrow it down. If you find some interesting things in there, then that's when you take the next step. That makes total sense, kind of coming from it. It's very interesting to
talk about that next step, because you're doing this again with a white hat on as a nonprofit, finding this stuff. how are you responsibly disclosing this?
It is a challenge, right? So you assume, oh, I found this data that I think belongs to. Well, first of all, you don't know who it belongs to necessarily. Bucket names might have nothing to do with the company name, right? So the bucket could be called, Southeast Backup Number 2 dash old, right? I don't know whose data that is, right? So first of all, in looking through the data, you have to be very careful that you don't want to disclose to the wrong party, right? Because my goal is not to out everyone. My goal is to find the correct people who can, solve this problem and make the least amount of noise about it. I don't want to call a lot of attention to what's in this bucket, right? So I'm not tweeting out, oh, hey, national grocery store chain, I just found all of your HR data, right? So I'm trying to find the person who can fix the problem. But it's not always clear who owns this data, right? There's lots of situations where, let's say I find an X-ray, right, or a bunch of X-rays, 1,000 X-rays in a folder with people's names on it. Well, it's probably not the people whose X-rays it is who's sharing it, right? But it's associated with a hospital. But is it the hospital, or is it the medical imaging company, or is it the managed service provider that manages the medical imaging company's network, or is it the company that manages the firmware on the X-ray machines, right? It's very difficult to sort of tease through, and that's actually kind of the joy of it. Is it really is a puzzle and a mystery in just about every bucket to figure out who is the responsible party to disclose to. And then once you have that, once you feel like, hey, I'm telling the right people, now you've got to do it in a way that they believe you, right? Some random person on the internet tells you that you've got a security problem. You probably shouldn't believe them, right? And so when I notify people, I actually start out with, don't believe anything that you read in this email. Don't trust anything that I'm telling you, but please give it to someone whom you do trust, who is in charge of your information security program or software development or IT or someone else. Don't click on any links in here, although there will be links. And just basically, like, you don't have to trust me, right? I'm not trying to gain your confidence. Like, I'm trying to convince you to be less sort of trusting. And I'll usually send out an email. It's very tricky. People don't want to be told bad news, and people don't typically spend a lot of effort trying to find out how they screwed up. So it's very, very challenging. Typically, I'll reach out if I can find someone in security. I'll reach out to that person. Honestly, I tend to do better reaching out to more junior members of a security team because they are very likely to investigate and then, like, hey, look what I encountered. Whereas more senior members are more likely to, try to explain away, oh, that can't be us. That's not our issue. Not every organization that I, work with has a security team. In fact, probably most don't. So, whoever I can get to, but people don't always respond well, or sometimes they don't respond at all. Frequently, they don't respond at all.
Yeah, it's very in line with our founder story here, the Get Guardian. Originally, Jeremy and Eric were reaching out to people, and they said, half of them said, "Leave me alone. Don't tell me about this." Or, "Why are you looking at our data? Why are you
Yeah.
looking at our repos?" It's like, well, they're in public. It's not just us looking at them. We're just trying to tell you.
Yeah.
It's difficult to so a common response is, that's not our data, and I'll say, well, it might not be your data, but you're definitely responsible for it, right? Like, your name's on the letterhead, right? These are your employees. This is their W-2s. Like, another common response will be, and this is like a typical CISO level response. Like, I'll have someone look into it, and then I'll follow up, and they'll say, we looked into it, and it turns out that data is supposed to be public. And I'll say, no, I've done 1,000 of these in the last couple of months. Like, I don't waste my time. If it's not the real deal, go back and check again. But it's difficult to get people to kind of acknowledge. Sometimes they get on it right away and they're like, oh my God, thank you. This is awesome. So happy that you sent this. can I send you a weird pie or something
A weird
that we
pie.
baked here at the pie factory. Um, and then sometimes I've had more than once, attorneys just reach back out and they want to know, like, why are you looking at our company data? And, the answer is because you published it, right? You may not have realized that you published it, but you did. And, I'm trying to do you a solid here. Um,
Yeah.
but sometimes it takes some explaining. Sometimes I jump on conference calls with people and say, "Hey, look, this is exactly what I see. This is how I got to it." And weirdly enough, sometimes people don't even fix it after one or two sessions.
Yeah, yeah. It's a big issue, the disclosure of it. I was doing a talk at a conference, and someone came up to me after, and part of the talk in the conference I was doing is I was explaining how a misconfigured Git repository, like if you've misconfigured your Git server, how someone could access that. And
Mm-hmm.
this person came up to me and said, "Hey, I've got a I've got a text document of 30. I was doing some research. I got a text document of 30,000 publicly accessible Git servers that probably shouldn't be publicly accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want it?" And I said, "Hell no, because I have no idea how I'm going to contact 30,000 people." I just don't know what to do with it, because the disclosing it is is so difficult. So I'm saying that to tip my hat off to you of actually going through that process, because it's a big job, and requires and people aren't always that thankful about it, which is a
Um,
challenge.
they're not, but sometimes, they don't necessarily need to be thankful. It's sometimes the downstream people who have no idea that this is happening, right? The customer of the
Mm,
customer, right? The person whose social is actually on the invoice, or, the person whose medical information is actually in the x-ray, who will never know.
yeah.
That's kind of the people that you're trying to do this for.
So let's look at it from the other side of things,
Mm-hmm.
from the defensive point of view. And it's an interesting thing with security vulnerabilities. I mean, often these things are never malicious. Mistakes happen, misconfigurations happen. Stuff happens. But what can you do if you're an organization and you're wanting to make sure that your buckets are secure? What are kind of what can you do
So,
from the
so
defensive
the
side?
first thing is to figure out where your buckets are and who's creating them, because I
Mm,
can tell you that, being a long time person in this space, it used to be that we had tech sprawl, but you're sort of limited by the amount of people who could physically put stuff in racks, right? Um, Now with buckets, you have tech sprawl that's all over the place, and a lot of IT departments don't have, or security departments don't have, a really good handle or control over who is creating what where, right? So you've got multiple spread out dev teams who are creating Azure resources under multiple tenants, who are creating AWS stuff when they need that, who are working with a vendor who's just spun up something in GCP. And everybody's going to sort of, figure that the security part of it later, right? But there is no later, right? And then projects get abandoned and stuff just sits there. So like anything else, you can't defend what you have unless you know what you have. And if you're an organization of sufficient size, you probably have more of this stuff, or are responsible for more of this stuff than you know about, right? So getting a handle on that, whether it's, developer education, or whether it's like locking down who can create new resources, um, it's a huge issue. So that's number one step, is making sure that you know what you have. Secondly, if you know what you have, there's pretty good tools, right? If you
mm,
Amazon has good tools for identifying what's improperly configured. GCP, same thing. Azure, same thing. Third party tools, something like Wiz or something else that can plug in all that and just give you one console for, fire off an alert. This bucket just got created. It's open, right? This thing has credentials in it. 60% of your organization can see it internally, right? Those kinds of alerts are great. Um, Not everybody has kind of the resources to put that together, so it is a challenge.
So we're coming to the end here. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about Sky Witness specifically, like where can people find more information? What's the future hold for the company or for your organization, and all that?
So just to reiterate, the mission of SkyWitness is to allow organization so you mentioned you got a list of 30,000 things, and there's no way to do that disclosure, and you probably can't. But if you could do 5 of them, that might be a good thing for the world, right? That's 5 people or 5 organizations that are going to be better off for your efforts. So we're not trying to purge the world of open buckets. That would be great. But what we're trying to do is just find those 5, just find 10, however much we can do to, do the right thing for a few organizations and raise awareness. That's what we're looking to do. There's a lot of people who are interested in this, who can't do it full time, who are concerned about the liability of doing it under their professional name. So we're trying to be a resource for people who, if you have information on open buckets, if you don't know how to disclose, if you want some help with that, we can help you do that. We can also do training or provide, situations where people can learn more about it, and kind of take it from there and see where it grows. I would love to start pressuring organizations like Amazon, and I've talked to Amazon, I've talked to Google, I've talked to Microsoft about this. They all really they all want to sell customers something that will help them solve this problem. But the fact is that they have the resources at hand to solve it themselves. They could easily build exactly what I'm building, right? Tear through their buckets and say, you know what, there's W-2s in here. We can use machine learning or something to figure that out, and then just notify the owners themselves, right? Regardless of whether or not you're a premium customer. Until they do that, we're gonna do it ourselves, and maybe make a little community around it, and of people who are interested in getting into OSINT, or maybe exploring OSINT from other perspectives, and this is their avenue in. A lot of the people that I talk to become who were previously like me. They encountered this data, or they encountered this problem, and then somebody kind of showed it to them, and then they kind of got hooked on looking for other problems. And so there's a little community of folks who are interested in taking this forward, and that's what we're doing with it. Hopefully, it'll be a fun ride.
Yeah. Well, look, it sounds awesome, and we really appreciate people like you putting in the effort to making these things possible, and as you put it, to clean up the internet, to clean up the streets of the internet, which I quite liked. Look, we have come to the end of kind of the formal part of the podcast, but we always like to play a bit of a game with our guests before we end off, called Best and Worst. And we're always asking, what is the best security advice that you would give our listeners? And then we're also going to ask you, what is the worst advice that you hear or you know is kind of out there? But let's start with the best. What's the best security advice that you would give the listeners of the podcast?
The best security advice I have is one of perspective. You have to stop thinking about your data as an asset, because in most cases, it's actually a liability. Right? If you're not operationalizing this data, if this data is not making you money right now, or isn't going to make you money in the future, get rid of it. Right? You don't need resumes from 20 years ago. You don't need W-2s from people who haven't worked in your organization in 15 years. You don't need grocery lists. You don't need to be storing all this data. It used to be that data was cheap, so you would just store it and store it and store it. And organizations created these unfortunate data retention policies that erred on the side of hoarding data. But in reality, I mean, I can't think of how many organizations just wouldn't be in trouble if they just deleted stuff that they don't need. Organizations tend to think of their data in terms of what is its value to me. If you think about it in terms of what is its value to an attacker, then it's a much different picture, right? And people will spend money to protect data that's valuable to them, but they won't spend money to protect data that isn't valuable to them but might be valuable to someone else. So get rid of that stuff. Have a formal program to just go through. Your data retention policy should not be about retaining data. Your data retention policy should be about purging yourself of data that is a liability to you. That's my advice.
Good advice. And let's flip it on its head. What's the worst advice that you kind of hear out there in the ethos?
I'm going to go outside of the realm of buckets and say the worst advice, honestly, and I cringe every time I hear it, is this constant refrain of don't open attachments or links from people that you don't know, right? And it's insidious because it sort of implies that, well, you can trust everyone that you know, right? And I would like to trust the people that I know, but just the way that email firewalls work today, the way that compromise spreads throughout industries and organizations, it is always the people that you know who are compromised, who then sent out a mass email to their mailbox, who sent out a mass email to their mailbox. Those are how successful compromises spread, right? For kind of low level, non spear phishing type email attacks. I see probably 5-to-1 random or 5-to-1 emails coming from other people in your industry that are likely to be malicious, as opposed to just random stuff that you pulled off, that you got in your inbox. So
yeah. No,
yeah.
I completely agree. I really like the way you framed that, because it does. Don't trust links from people you don't know, but then everyone totally trustworthy. Don't worry about it.
And know is kind of relative, right? Like, I know of this person, right? They're in my industry, right? They also work at whatever, Lockheed, right? That doesn't mean that
Yeah, there was a Google Drive. There was a Google Drive attack. Oh man, like 8 years ago, 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. Basically, it was nefarious because it would go through the organization and email your other contacts within the organization a link that looked like it went to Drive, but did some nasty stuff along the way. And I remember that hit my old company pretty hard, because
it never went away. It's just morphed into a million different versions, and it's rampant.
It was all because we could trust it. Like, it's from Ben. Of course, we're going to open it from Ben.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, look, we've come to the end. It's been a really fun episode. I've really enjoyed all the insights that you're given. I'm stealing that phrase that you used about mining the data. I'm going to shamelessly use that from now on, because I think it was brilliant and really describes it well. But look, thanks so much for coming on. I'm sure everyone here really enjoyed it. Dwayne, do you have any final words before we click the big red button?
No, just remind everybody, skywitness.org is where you can go, keep tabs on what's going on out there with this project. And I hope this has encouraged everybody to think about where their data is a little bit more, and therefore making the world a little bit safer. So thanks for being here and spreading the message, Glenn.
Thanks a lot, guys. It's fun.